Welcome to Between Two Chairs, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate, the podcast that brings you the latest insights and trends on the South Florida commercial real estate market, with your hosts, Fernando Arencibia Jr. and Jennifer Wollmann. In each episode, we dive into the world of commercial real estate and break down complex concepts to make them accessible for everyone. Whether you're a real estate professional, a curious investor, or just interested in the South Florida market in general, Between Two Chairs is the podcast for you. So pull up a chair and join us.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Between Two Chairs. My name is Fernando Arencibia. I thank you very much for joining me. And with me, as always, is the ever so supportive, my partner, Jennifer Wollmann. Jennifer, say hello and introduce our very special guest.
Hello, everybody. We're so excited today because Fernando and I are Lonnie Hendry / TreppWire groupies. So we are super excited that Lonnie Hendry is joining us today on our episode, Demystifying Commercial Real Estate. And Lonnie is the Chief Product Officer at Trepp, a data modeling and analytics firm that specializes in commercial real estate, CMBS, and CLO markets. Don't worry, we're going to demystify those for you in the future. And he is also co-host with Stephen Bushbaum of the TreppWire Podcast that has more than 1.1. You're probably up at like 1.5 million listeners by now. Fernando and I, in Between Two Chairs, want to be TreppWire when we grow up. What I love about Lonnie's perspective is that it's based on such a vast experience across every pretty much commercial real estate sector. He's done about everything in real estate and is more than 20 years in the industry, from conventional multifamily property management, development, commercial and residential leasing, brokerage, appraisal, etc. He's a much sought after speaker, and he is a professor and is helping prepare the next generation of professionals as an adjunct professor at Texas Tech University. Thank you so much for joining us, Lonnie.
I'm happy to be here. I really appreciate you guys having me on your show. And I'll tell you, your show is great, and you'll get to where Trepp is. We've just been fortunate that we've been doing this since 2020. And I think consistency, and it's one of those things like investing, is time in the market sometimes is more important than timing the market. So happy to be a guest and happy to support your guys' show.
Well, we really appreciate you. Before we get started, give us some insights into you. We know that you live in Texas, you travel a lot, you have a great, you have wonderful playlists. I love your playlists. I told you I'm a groupie, but I sound a little bit more like a stalker. Can you tell me what you like to do when you aren't traveling, teaching, recording, speaking?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I'm kind of a boring person. I pretty much live, eat, sleep, breathe commercial real estate 24/7. As you mentioned, I am on the road a lot, and I joke and tell people sometimes I feel like my address is American Airlines, row 12, seat C, because it feels like that's where I live most of the time. But I like to I drag race. Me and my dad restore muscle cars and drag race, so that's a hobby. I like to read books. I love to listen to music. Then obviously, my kiddos are at the age where it's like crazy sports stuff every night and everything else. And so if I'm not working, which is not that frequently because I work a lot, as you mentioned, teaching, working at Trepp, I have a brokerage business. I do a lot of stuff in the market. I'm doing a little bit of drag racing, listening to some music, or maybe mowing the grass. So not too exciting.
Awesome. There are people, if you love what you do, you're never really working, right? And you're never really vacationing, because we're CRE 100% of the time.
100%. I mean, like, listen, you get paid when deals close. The market never sleeps. And to your point, I love it. I mean, this is what I've done since I was about 19 years old. And, being in and around the commercial real estate market, as soon as I got my first job in multifamily property management, and I worked for a local developer, they bought land, entitled to properties, built multifamily apartments. I ended up managing some low-income housing tax credits for them, managed some high-end Class A stuff for them. I was hooked. And so here we are, 20 plus years later. And I love commercial real estate more today than I probably did then, just because now I have this incredible network of people like you all and others that I've been able to meet through my journey. And it's just awesome to see there's some universal truths to commercial real estate across the industry. And it's, people love helping each other. It's very much a network-oriented business, relationship-driven. And then the dynamic components of the market, the fundamentals, what drives value, what drives transactions. I just love seeing how different people approach that and how the market reacts.
Great. Thank you. So let's jump right into this episode, since we're all about demystifying commercial real estate. And I threw out, CMBS and CLO. Can you give us some very brief discussion or intro as to what CMBS is and pros and cons?
Sure. So in the early 90s, the market decided to start offering a securitized or bundled investment option where they were bundling commercial real estate loans. So this process of securitization is basically taking a bunch of underlying collateral, whatever it is, student loans, credit cards, auto loans, airplane loans, whatever, and you package them together and you create a security, and then the interest payments become payable to the bondholders. And so effectively in the early 90s, they took that securitization process and they started doing that with commercial mortgages. So the term CMBS is just commercial mortgage-backed security. And so it basically says it's a security that's comprised of commercial mortgages that back up that security. And so on a typical CMBS deal, you may have somewhere between 60 and 80 loans that get pooled into one security that gets sold on the bond market and effectively adds as a secondary capital market. So as soon as that security gets offered to the market, then those lenders can go back to the market, make some new loans. And so it creates liquidity. We see it with Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. On the residential side, they've been doing this. Those RMBS, residential mortgage-backed securities, may have 1,000 loans just because of the size of the loans. But on the commercial side, it's usually less than 100. And you see those issued, when the market's really healthy, you may see several issuances per month. When the market's a little bit tighter, then you might see, maybe just one or two securities a month. So it's a great investment vehicle. And then Trepp is unique. We're written into the reporting structure. And so in the early 90s, when this first started getting kicked off, Trepp was written into that structure. So we actually are a recipient of the underlying data at the property level for all properties that are financed using CMBS.
Great. And Trepp does have a great 101 CMBS 101 series. I told you, groupie. And we will include that link for our listeners.
Yeah. And go ahead. Sorry, Fernando.
No. It's great. I just wanted, for the sake of a young commercial broker coming into the industry, and when they're working with a client who is either doing a commercial loan from a regional bank, but now they're doing a commercial backed security loan, right? Can you explain to that broker what are the differences that they're going to look for as their customer is going through the process of getting that loan?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at the end of the day, a lot of the underwriting and a lot of the process is going to be very similar in the sense that lenders want to make sure that they're making loans on good collateral. They want to make sure that they understand how is the property performing, what's the revenue, what are the expenses, what's the NOI, how confident are they that the building can actually produce the NOI that's being underwritten, what's the quality of the sponsor, who's the borrower. Like those things are fairly universal. The primary difference is, generally speaking, if you take out a loan from a regional or community bank, you as the borrower are probably going to have to sign some form of a personal guarantee against that loan. That gives additional security to the lender, and it allows them in some instances to be a little more flexible with the individual circumstances of that property or the borrower. So it works for both parties. The borrower maybe gets a little bit more favorable terms or some flexibility on being able to prepay the loan, et cetera. But in exchange for that flexibility, they have to sign a personal guarantee. So if the loan goes bad, they're going to be liable for some portion, if not all of the loan. In the CMBS world, they're considered non-recourse loans. So unless the borrower does something that's explicitly lined out as a carve-out, like as long as they comply with the terms of the agreement, they don't have personal liability or recourse on the loan. The only security from the lender's perspective is just the property itself. And so it's favorable for the borrower in many instances because they can avoid that personal guarantee, but the terms are generally more favorable for the lender in that case. So effectively, you're locking yourself into a 10-year term in most instances. In 2023, first part of 24, they started offering 5-year CMBS loans because the interest rates were so high. So CMBS by definition is generally fixed rate financing. So people were not wanting to lock in super high rates for 10 years. So they've offered a 5-year package. But in either instance, you're effectively locked in for that 5 to 10 years. There's yield maintenance or prepayment penalties that have to be contemplated because the bondholders are expecting repayment over that full 10-year term. So if you sell the property before the 10 years as a borrower, you're going to have to pay some sort of a fee before you can actually get out of that deal, because the bondholders are going to need to be made whole on those interest payments over the full 10 years or 5 years, whichever loan. So no recourse, but a little bit more stringent terms. And so for a borrower or broker, those are some high level things that you would have to consider. And it makes sense in several instances to do one or the other, so I think it's nice to have options.
Well, and we saw this during the pandemic, that there was also less flexibility in renegotiating or postponing payments with CMBS loans because, as you said, it's a security product, not a one-on-one with your local bank. So those were a little bit more difficult to modify.
Yeah, in fact, I don't know if you saw the same thing, but we heard from a lot of landlords that were holding CMBS loans that they were encouraged not to even call to ask if there was anything, because they would be put on a list of, I guess, a list of concern.
It's CMBS loans are very covenant heavy. So to your point, there's not a lot of flexibility. There are remedies. Usually, though, the property has to be in default in order for a special servicer to be appointed, and then for the borrower to be able to negotiate some of those terms. And that comes with some risk, and that comes with some potential downside. So, the idea is CMBS is predominantly used for stabilized properties with predictable cash flows, where the property should produce the NOI that's underwritten. It's not really a mechanism for value add or reposition type of properties, or properties with a significant amount of upside where the borrower is hoping to transform the property in a couple of years and then turn around and sell it. It's definitely more for the stabilized long-term owner that effectively says, look, I can lock in a good interest rate. I can lock in some terms. As long as I make the payment every month, I'm going to have no problems. But to your point, Jennifer, if they have some challenges, that regional bank or community bank is going to be much more forgiving and understanding. And that's a relationship-driven type of lender, whereas CMBS is very transactional.
Great. Thank you so much. What about, what is a CLO?
So CLO is interesting. So that stands for collateralized loan obligation. And effectively, those are bridge loans, which means they're 24 to 36 month initial terms. They have, 1, 2, or 3 12-month extension options after the initial term. And these are completely opposite of what I just described in CMBS. These are for those short-term value add reposition type of loans where the borrower is buying a property today at, $100 million, thinking that in 3 years they're going to be able to sell the property for $150 million. And so in most cases, these were floating rate loans that were taken out. So just to give some context, over the last 5 years, there's been about $150 billion worth of CRE CLO issuance. About 70% of that $150 billion has been in multifamily, and probably 50 or 60% of that has been in the Sunbelt states. And so all of us have seen these 1970s vintage Class C apartments that were getting bought at very low cap rates. And the buyer was assuming they were going to, renovate the property, paint the outside, renovate the interior of the units, and increase rents 20% per year. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened in a lot of cases. And the floating rate component of the loans have become problematic. So when these loans were taken out and call it 2019 through 2021, interest rates were on these initial terms were 2% on the initial interest rate. In 2023, when the Fed started raising rates, some of these have rates now that are 9, 10%. It was okay initially because the lender required that the borrower buy an interest rate cap when they first financed the property, which means that there was downside risk for the lender was protected. So even if rates went to 10%, the borrower would be capped at maybe 4.5 or 5%. The challenge is they didn't usually require that they buy an interest rate cap for all of the extension options on the front end of the deal. So as soon as that 24 or 36 month term expired, well, guess what? Now rates really are 9%. Trying to buy an interest rate cap in that unstable environment was much more costly. And if borrowers couldn't do it or lenders didn't require it, they were still having to pay 7, 8, 9% interest on properties that hadn't been able to achieve the 20% rent growth that they had underwritten. So you see this really interesting dynamic with the CLOs where there's some real challenge right now with that subset of the market.
So when we were talking about CMBS, you mentioned special servicing. This will be our last definition, I promise. Well, maybe. Can you just describe what special servicing is for our listeners? Because I think that's going to get into some of our next questions about the distress.
Sure. So and just to make you feel comfortable, I think in every speaking engagement I've ever done, because I'm a professor at heart, I have to have at least a little bit of definition in every presentation, every podcast episode, et cetera. So I appreciate this actually. So special servicing is when a property goes default in CMBS. So they haven't made a payment for 60 days, call it. Then a special servicer will get appointed. And effectively, just like for you and I, if you own a home and you're making your mortgage payments, every month that you send your mortgage payment in, it actually goes to a servicer, which effectively acts on behalf of the lender. They process the payment. They make sure everyone that's supposed to get the funds gets the funds. Same thing happens in CMBS. They all have a master servicer, which processes the loan data every month, supposing everything is just going into plan. If someone goes into default, then it gets sent to a special servicer, which is just effectively a little bit closer to the deal. They're going to reach out. They're going to be more proactive with the borrower. They're going to find out what's going on. They may order a new appraisal. They may start cash trapping or sweeping some of the excess cash flow to make sure that things get put in towards the mortgage payment or TIs or leasing commissions or whatever other covenants are in the contract. And so they're effectively just a liaison between the master servicer, which handles the everyday payment stuff when things are going well, the bondholders, and the borrower. And so if something is considered in special servicing, it just means that it has that appointed third party that's keeping a closer eye on managing the transaction. If the loan gets current, so let's just say the borrower is able to make the loan current, then it transfers back to the master servicer, and the special servicer is no longer involved. If for some reason they're not able to make it current and they stay in a delinquent status, then the special servicer will manage that. And if they end up having to go through foreclosure or something like that, the special servicer handles all of that as well.
Great. Thank you so much. So we've been hearing a while about issues in the market, and that's why I tune in to TreppWire every Thursday, because you guys are so on point with everything.
Yeah.
So, and there's a lot of, they say if it bleeds, it leads. So there's all these negative headlines on different podcasts and newspapers and everything else that banks are going to fail. There's a, financial Armageddon, all because of these CMBS and CLO loans out there. What are you seeing in the data? Can you give us some insight on that?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. If the headlines were true, we'd be recording this podcast at a bar because we wouldn't be working in CRE anymore. I mean, the reality is there some truth to the headlines? Yes. Is there a bunch of hyperbole in the headlines? Yes. Is there distress? Of course. Are we on the front end of the distress cycle? In my opinion, yes. We've seen a lot of stuff over the last month or two saying that market prices and the distress in the market has bottomed out, potentially maybe on the transaction side. But the debt side, the mortgage side, we're still super early in the process. So just to give some point of reference, during the Great Financial Crisis, which started around 2008, we didn't actually hit the peak delinquency until July of 2012. And that delinquency was 10.34%. And so it took 4 years plus to get to the peak delinquency. We started this disruption. The Fed started raising interest rates in July of 22. So we're nowhere near 4 years beyond that point. And at this point, overall delinquency in the CMBS market is just over 5%. Office is the high water mark at about 8%. So I would say we're still super early in the distress cycle. And something I've learned and I've said, frequently is the headlines just move faster than the distress does. So if you just get information from headlines, you're gonna be really down in the dumps. But the reality is, for every one negative headline, there's a transaction that's taking place. We've had a lot of really strong issuance in 2024. So just round numbers, if you look at CMBS issuance through August of 2023, it was about $25 billion. If you look at CMBS issuance through August of 2024, it's $65 billion. So we're up some multiple this year compared to last year. So I would suggest that, yes, there's going to be more distress. I think it's important for us to say real estate by definition is local and sometimes hyper local in nature. You could have two buildings on the same street that have completely different outcomes. And so national headlines, national narratives, they don't apply to every market. But are there some markets that are really struggling? Yes, San Francisco, Chicago, LA, Washington, D.C., Seattle. Like there's definitely some markets that are facing some pain. But for every one of those, there's a Dallas, a Miami, and others that are still like, they're like, what's this recession you're talking about? What's this slowdown you're talking about? Because they don't seem to be affected by it.
So given the fact that we're in the early phases of the distress, should people who are waiting on the sidelines, I know there's a ton of powder. I know everybody's waiting for something to give because the market is so unstable and CRE likes the knowns and stability.
Right.
Is it too early to really start releasing some of those funds and start buying? Is it better to wait 2 or 3 years down the road? What are you guys seeing?
So I would say in any market, there's opportunity to buy. I think that's one of those narratives that kind of gets embedded into the CRE mindset of we should wait for the right time to buy. And I would suggest if that's the mentality, you would never buy anything. It's almost like waiting until you're ready to have kids or waiting until you're ready to afford a house. Like if you wait, by definition, the price goes up, the market shifts. What your goal was, heading into that usually changes. And so at some level, you shouldn't be buying just to buy in any instance. Like you should make sure fundamentally the investment makes sense. But having some perception that like waiting is somehow going to get you a better buying opportunity, I think is a risky proposition. I mean, just as an example, let's just say the Fed, which, Jerome Powell last week in Jackson Hole said they're ready to pivot on the rates. So let's say in September we get 25 or 50 basis point rate reduction. The math doesn't change a lot for these upcoming maturities and the challenges and stuff that's been well documented. If you're in a 3.5% interest rate and you have to refi into a 7, or you have to refi into a 6.5 because they lower rates, you're still going from a 3.5 to a 6.5. It's still net negative for you. But if you have dry powder on the sidelines, maybe that 50 basis point reduction in rates makes some of those deals that you like a little more palatable. And if that happens and people start deploying that capital at scale, guess what's going to happen to prices?
Right.
They're going to ramp right back up. And so this narrative of like, wait and see, I think is a little bit risky, but it doesn't change the fact that you still have to make sure the fundamentals and the property can produce the results that you're needing it to for it to make a sound investment.
Yeah.
I love that answer because it's true. We hear that all the time. Oh, prices are going to crash. Everything's going to fail. I'm going to buy in foreclosure. Right. It's like, yeah, you and everybody.
Exactly. And we see it very much so when we talk about the office market here in South Florida, where people don't realize that it is the healthiest, office market in the country. And the opportunities that people are hearing about nationwide don't always apply to every, hyperlocal market. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about Trepp and the way that you break down the data specifically, Lonnie. And I do want to say as a public service announcement that if anybody who's listening is attending a conference and you see that Lonnie is speaking at the conference, it is a must-see. Get your seats early because you're going to get a lot of great information. You're an amazing presenter and you have a great way of presenting the complex information in a way that is very understandable. So I very much appreciate that. One of the things I really enjoy is that you break down the asset classes very clearly so that people really understand what is happening. Recently, we went to a conference and we heard from some research from the Atlanta Fed, and there were a couple of things that caught my eye, and I would love your opinion on it. One of the things that really caught the eye of everyone in the audience, and this was a Florida presentation, was that they were saying that multifamily vacancies in Florida were higher than the national average, 10 points versus 8 points. And that caught our eyes because, of course, as practitioners, we're just not seeing those vacancies, level up to that level. So I'll start there. Are you seeing the same thing? Are we seeing a shift in the multifamily asset class in the state of Florida?
I think it's too early to say that. I think there are some contributing factors to those results. And if you look at it in 2023, in the first part of 2024, nationally, there was 1.1 million new multifamily units delivered. South Florida has had significant migration. There's been a lot of construction. There's been a lot of activity. So if you look at it in a snapshot view, it may give you the sense that there's, this really significant increase in vacancy, and there's maybe some cause for concern. I would suggest, I think it's probably just a little bit of a short-term blip in the sense that there's been a lot of new construction delivered and high-end construction where it's really high prices. It's a segment of the market that's catered to that South Florida resident. But if you look at 25, 26, 27, 28, the new construction pipeline is really thin. So for those property owners that maybe right now have seen vacancy go from 7% to 10%, over the next couple of years, it's going to swing back in their favor, in my opinion, because you're not going to see this influx of new construction at the scale that you had over the last 5 or 7 years. So, you guys are living there and see it every day. If you look at the new high-end multifamily units that have been delivered across the cities, I know Brickell, there's a bunch of just developments everywhere. You're going to see a little bit of a pullback on the construction side, and I think that pricing demand and then the vacancy will swing back in the favor of the owner. And again, the numbers, it depends on how you look at it. If you look at a 10-year average, if vacancy is 7, 8, 9, 10%, that's probably in the range of what historical stabilized occupancy is. It's just during 21 and 22, things got really, really tight. And so people with short-term perspective sometimes feel like, oh, we've seen a huge expansion. But if you looked at multifamily, any city across the U.S. over a 10-year time horizon, 95 to 90, 5 to 10% vacancy or 95 to 90% occupancy is not outside the range of comfort for them.
Yeah. I like that perspective because I think also what happens is that we tend to ignore other data pieces that we know to be a fact, which is that for over 10 years, we've been underdeveloping units in the entire country. And so, when all of a sudden you have a surge, we want to encourage that surge. And to your point, some of that adjustment might be just temporary. And if you have a long-term view and you look at, where you're coming from and the fact that, we're far away from catching up to the number of units that are missing in the marketplace. The other item that was really interesting to us, and, we would love to hear if you are, in fact, seeing the same thing, is that we know that regulated, bank lenders have been conservative in their approach towards CRE. However, even with that conservative approach, they have had the added risk that there's uncertainty and inaccuracy sometimes in asset valuations. One of the examples they mentioned is that they were looking at this portfolio. They gave it to, about 7 different appraisers, and they have valuations that range from $8 billion to $32 billion. And so that valuation has really created great concern. And one of the things he mentioned is that some lenders are adding premiums to the appraisal cap rates, 100, 200 basis points, which of course is changing the loan to value. It's really making it. So is that a trend that you're seeing? And, is that something that we should be aware that will continue on for the near future?
So I think it's where we're at in the cycle. When things are going really well and there's a lot of transaction activity and there's a lot of sales data and there's a lot of cap rate data and there's a lot of income and expense data flowing through the marketplace, appraisal is a lot easier because you have good recent data to use to formulate a value for the asset. When you're in this part of the cycle where transaction velocity is a lot slower, there's a lot less sales, there's a lot less leasing activity, there's a lot more uncertainty, it gets to be very problematic. I think the appraisal profession is kind of at a crossroad at some level where you have technology that's really advanced across the CRE spectrum. So regardless of if you're a lender, if you're a broker, if you're a tenant rep or a landlord rep on the leasing side, you leverage technology every single day, and it's helping make your business more scalable, make more money, et cetera. In the appraisal practice, they're using technology to identify sales comps and income and expense data. But since they're looking backwards, if that data doesn't exist, or in this case, if you had a sale that took place when interest rates were 2.5%, and you're trying to value a property today in an 8% interest rate environment, you have to make some adjustments to that. And that's where the fuzzy part comes in, the gray area, where you might get some 7 different opinions from 7 different appraisers. Like, that part doesn't surprise me. We've talked a lot about this on our podcast. Like, I think appraisals by definition are an opinion of value as of a specific date. The specific date part is the part that's interesting in this part of the cycle. There's really no mark to market from a lender's perspective on what the value of the asset is unless the borrower stops making the payments. And so when you get a new refinance or a new origination, you're going to have a new appraisal, and you should assume that those appraisals are going to be reflective of the current market. But if you have a loan on your books right now that has a value from 2018, the lender's looking at that. As long as they're making the payments, they're not concerned about what the actual value today is. But the reality is the value is probably different than it was in 2018, especially if it's an office building, even if the borrower is making payments. So I think the appraisal profession, you're going to see some changes with that. I think you're going to see the lenders, as you mentioned, verifying more of the appraisals. I mean, traditionally lenders will go through and do like an appraisal review, but they're not effectively recalculating a value. They're just making sure that the appraiser complied with USPAP, did the necessary steps, et cetera. I think you're going to see a little bit more conscious effort made to say, do we think these comparables are in fact comparable? Do we think these adjustments are in fact reasonable? Do we think this income pro forma or this cap rate is reflective of the market? And if not, I think you're going to see them, to your point, adding a little bit of a premium, maybe be more conservative on the LTV, et cetera. I would be remiss if I didn't plug our data. I mean, like, this is an exact one-to-one use case for Trepp. Like, we have owner-submitted income and expense financial data every quarter on every property in our data set. We have cap rates on all new issuance. We have appraisals on all new issuance and refinances. If appraisers are not using our data, they're putting themselves at risk of having the lender start to question how and why they did what they did.
So to our listeners, if you are either buying a property or have a client who's buying a property, make sure that the appraiser has Trepp data. That should be one of your top questions, that they're local, that they know the market, the local market,
they're using
and
Trepp
that they're
data.
using Trepp data.
I agree.
Are there any specific, I know Trepp came out with a white paper recently, bulls and bears markets and asset classes. Are there any specific Southeast Florida markets or asset classes that your data is pointing to in our market that is bull or bear?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Miami broadly, everything is really strong still. I mean, it's like from a relative perspective, Miami is like leading the pack across the U.S. in terms of just activity, sentiment, momentum, all of the things that you want to see. Like, I know in the last 6 or 8 weeks, I've definitely started seeing some headlines around the residential market slowing down and all this other stuff. But again, I think some of that is short-term in nature. I think it's a little bit, we're short-sighted in thinking that things are just going to appreciate in value or rates are going to grow at 12% every year. You guys have been on a tear. I mean, look at your industrial. There's zero availability across the metros. I don't see that changing anytime soon. Like, there's an insatiable appetite for that. Your multifamily is going to maybe have a little bit of a lull period. But again, on the face of it, relative to other markets, Miami is going to be really, really strong. Office, I mean, last time I was there, I think I counted something like 30 construction cranes or 40 construction cranes between the conference center and the airport. And so, like, I think Miami broadly is still where people want to put their money. It's still where people want to move. There's a lot of momentum. And I think, you guys, both with your podcast and just with the mayor, with everyone that's kind of like promoting South Florida, there's been a lot of really good stuff done to keep the momentum. And I think that you're going to see more people coming there. I mean, Florida broadly has seen massive amounts of net in-migration. And I don't foresee that slowing down. And so every corporate relocation, I read something this week that Foot Locker was like moving their corporate headquarters from New York down to Florida. With every one of those moves, just increases the value of just that South Florida lifestyle, the CRE aspect, and so much more there that you just can't replicate in other places.
Were there any surprises in that white paper for you? I mean, I know Seattle came out as at the top of the bulls, and I think Phoenix, Arizona are in the bears. But was there any information there that really caught your eye?
I think it's an interesting. We're going to start doing that report every month because the data changes near real time, right?
Awesome.
So
that's great.
It's interesting. Like depending on what month you look at the data for what property sector and what region, the data does look a little surprising in some instances, and others it doesn't. I mean, like Phoenix as an example. If you look at Phoenix 3 or 4 years ago, Phoenix would have been the top market across the U.S. They had crazy amount of capital coming in. You had multifamily properties trading there. It seemed like same property sold in 3 years and it increased in value like 100% on each sale. Now you're seeing a little bit of a pullback there. I was out in Phoenix maybe 2 months ago, and you're not seeing the activity that you saw before. Now, on the industrial side, you're seeing a significant amount of industrial development out there. So multifamily's really pulled back. Industrial, there's a lot of appetite for that out there in that market now. So I would just say like nothing that just jumped off the page, but we really enjoyed putting the report together because I think what it does is it captures that snapshot of where are these markets right now based on the available data. And I wouldn't be surprised if next month or 3 months from now, the markets that were the top bulls have moved into a different category and there's new markets in those bull positions, just because the markets are dynamic, as you both know. I mean, investors' appetite changes based on where they think they can get the best returns for their capital placement. So, data centers is one thing. They're like, we're seeing a huge transfer of interest, money flow, development dollars, et cetera, across major markets in the U.S. That could shift an entire commercial real estate landscape. I mean, you look in the Virginia markets, data centers are like driving those markets. It's the point where they're going to have some power issues at some point where they can't generate enough power to actually run them, which means that people are going to have to find alternative locations for some of those developments. Yeah. So as a data nerd, those reports and the other stuff we put out, I love it because you don't know what's going to happen. You look at the data and it tells the narrative for you.
I think this was going to be my stat at the end of our show, but because I read a very interesting article about how these data center providers were really having a difficult time filling in the space. They had an oversupply, and big companies like Amazon would negotiate because they were buying in bulk, negotiate great deals. But this is where what you hear in the headlines and where things happening affect commercial real estate. The advent of AI and everybody rushing right to AI and the need for that data center. Now, the balance is getting tipped where now the landlords of these data centers are actually, holding more leverage, right? And the rates are actually going up. So from a business perspective, things are looking up. And then of course there are challenges to acquiescing to, filling up all those spaces. But that's a very interesting dynamic, how the headlines, begin to give you some perspective as to how that affects, commercial real estate. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's interesting in the sense that the headlines were not false before. Like at one point, There was a glut of data center space, but the AI stuff has just, immediately transformed the desire and the need for those types of properties. And it's very similar. We saw the same type of thing with life science buildings during COVID, where life science was what everyone wanted to invest in. And you saw those prices go from, $200 a square foot on the sale side to sometimes $1,000 plus a square foot. But now we're in 2024 and you've seen that really come back the other direction. So, I think that's the part that we all love about the commercial real estate market is you cannot hold on firmly to your beliefs about something because the market dictates what happens and the market shifts based on demand. And that's the part that makes this fun. You can work in commercial real estate. I've been in it for 20 plus years. it's never the same. Every day, something different. Properties change, perspective of properties change. I remember when I first got in the business, industrial property brokers, they were always like, everyone out of college wanted to go into retail or multifamily or office. No one wanted to go into industrial. It was boring. It's just big square boxes. But now industrial is sexy. It's like logistics and all this technology. And if you're an office broker, it's like, oh, sorry, sucker, you're an office broker. And so it's just funny how the dynamics shift over time because the market changes.
So I think you also get a super interesting perspective, Lonnie, on advocacy and politics and everything, because you have the Trepp's offices are in New York at Rockefeller Center, and you're out of Texas, right? Two pretty much polar opposites in terms of their whole political, tax, everything environment. So can you shed a little bit of light, just your insights? It doesn't necessarily have to be Trepp data, but what you see on a bigger scale in terms of how those affect markets.
Yeah, so I think it's a very timely question, and you're going to be seeing, we didn't talk about this prior to the podcast, so for people listening, like this was not a softball question, but we're going to be putting out a bunch of research over the next couple of months on the impacts of regulation on the commercial real estate markets. If I were talking about the things that I think are putting CRE at most risk, first and foremost today is insurance costs. Insurance costs have gone through the roof. It's killing deals. There's not good market alternatives. There's not really a way that you can self-insure at scale for most people. That's the major concern today. But outside of that, if I'm looking down the road the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months, regulation is going to play an outsized role in what happens in certain markets. So the primary one is rent control or rent stabilized legislation across multifamily. And New York has one of the most predominant rent stabilization laws in effect, and it's effectively decimated those lower income rent stabilized type of opportunities for CRE owners. So effectively, they cap the rental side at a rental rate or a rental increase that makes the revenue side of the equation effectively zero on the uptick. But there's no caps in place for the expenses. And guess what? There's been a lot of expense inflation, and it really makes these not long-term viable real estate opportunities. They become like a short-term commodity where every year the properties get older, there's more deferred maintenance, and there's less impetus for the owner to put any capital into the building because they can never recoup that. And so I don't think you'll see, I'm hoping that you don't see that type of broad brush implemented rent control across the US. But if you listen to any of the elected officials that are running for office, that's a hot button topic for them that they think attracts voters. There has to be more nuance to it, though. We can't say real estate's local and hyper local and then apply broad brush regulations across an entire industry. It doesn't work. And in my opinion, like at some level, I'm not an economist, but it comes back to supply and demand. You want to make things more affordable. You want to help with affordability, build more units. It's really, really easy. Like you entitle properties to have denser development. You allow developers to come in and build those properties in locations where people want to live. And this affordability and some of this other stuff will take care of itself. And so regulation, it's beyond just rent control. There's a lot of other things I think are a net negative for the commercial real estate market. Now, I know down in Florida, I think you guys had, what is it, Live Local Act that just passed.
Yep.
And there's been a lot of resistance at the municipal level where they don't want to incorporate this higher density, higher zoning use case. But I applaud the market for saying Florida for saying we're going to pass this legislation, because at the end of the day, you have to have more available units. You need denser construction. There's this infrastructure benefit. There's efficiency. There's economy of scale. There's all these things that the market will benefit from if allowed to do it. We got to change the narrative that developers are not bad. All of us live in a house that at one point, or an apartment that at one point was built by a developer. We should have reason and restrictions that make sense. That's why you have, there's this concept of PEGs, physical, economic, government, and social. Those are factors that drive value. They should be working in some sort of equilibrium, though. You can't have the government side, zoning and regulation, outsized relative to the other components.
Great. And Florida also passed a a law where you can't do rent control, because we were seeing that happen in some counties where they were passing rent control legislation, and the state came in and said, not in our state. So yay for Florida.
In fact, it's in the Live Local Act, which is, may very well live out to be, one of the best things that Florida has ever done for really for our overall future and economy.
And just to get back kind of to your insurance statement that you made, I mean, obviously we're feeling it here. I think it's worldwide, just based on everything that's going on climate-wise and lawsuit-wise and everything else in the insurance industry.
Mm-hmm.
But you have a background in sustainability, and a lot of the sunshine states have issues, right? Phoenix, their heat index, Florida, our storms. What are you seeing from a sustainability standpoint? Are you seeing any major trends, either in specific asset classes, specific states? Can you touch on that a little bit?
So I think this is one of those things where I'm going to sound a little bit contradictory to my previous statement on the regulation and other things. This is one of those areas where you probably need a little bit of government intervention to say, we're going to require new development to meet a higher standard from a sustainability perspective. They're going to be they need to be developed in a more weather resistant fashion, where they either have some natural cooling elements, or they're designed in a way that provide, hurricane resistance and other things, because the market itself, like the developers by definition, are trying to maximize profits. And so those additional costs that come with these, sustainable initiatives, they don't want to incur those unless they have to. So this is one where I do think if you take a longer term perspective, there's value in creating buildings that are constructed in a way that's more resilient relative to the current climate that we're in. And to your point, the western half of the U.S., they have a water challenge. I mean, like, it's kind of been muted because of some of these other things, but there's going to be some local areas in the west part of the U.S. that, depending on what rainfall looks like on a year-to-year basis, they may have some real challenges. We saw California for a while had a drought. And, like, I was at some hotels in California where you check into the hotel, you go to take a shower, there'd be a laminated sign in the shower that says, please limit your shower to less than 5 minutes. I doubt people are listening to that when they're in the shower, but it's like they were cognizant of the fact, and they don't really have stormwater retention. All of it goes out to the ocean. There's things that we can do from an infrastructure perspective to make good use of the resources we have. So I think this is one area where the commercial real estate market will be slow to adopt or adapt because it's not profitable initially. But if you look at it from a long-term perspective, if we had taken some steps 20 years ago, some of these insurance challenges that we're having today might not be as severe, but we didn't build buildings to endure the type of stuff that we're experiencing. And now we're paying for it in the form of higher insurance. So I think the reality is you're going to pay for it one way or the other. It'd be better to pay for it on the front end and build a more resilient building than it is to have to deal with it on a case-by-case, transaction-by-transaction basis on the back end.
And I think part of the problem is that, to your point about how hyper local of an issue this is that really the fight for this happens in our zoning and planning departments, which are very slow to change, right? And to your point about the Live Local Act and how some municipalities are resistant to really adopt, the higher densities and all that change. But I'm thinking of an example which I think is pertinent to explain is, there is an area of Miami Beach that is called North Beach, which there's a grave amount of flooding. And everybody knows, including new developers and people that are developing in the area, that they're going to lose the first floor, right? If you build based on the current zoning, they are going to, in the future, have to lose the entire first floor, right? And so their plea to the zoning and planning departments, it says, if we know we're going to lose the first floor, why don't you let us build it with the loss of that first floor and let us add another floor, give us something to make sure that the numbers work and we can build a building that is resilient, right? But then, you have a lot of NIMBYism, but more importantly, you have a lot of resistance from that department to do something that is practical, right? That building is going to be there for many, many years, and very shortly it's going to be obsolete. And no developer, to your point about how, they get a bad rap, but no developer wants to build an obsolete building right? They want to build for the future. And if you make that a part of the conversation, we could have more resilient buildings, and in essence, be able to aid in this issue of insurance, long term, because you agree the insurance issue is not going to go away anytime soon. There is no quick fix to this.
Yeah, there's no. It's an archaic industry where you have a limited number of players that actually issue policies. If one of them pulls out of a market, and there's been a couple that have said, we're not writing policies in Florida anymore, we're not writing policies in California, that reduces that small number to an even smaller number. And then again, supply and demand kicks in. At that point, you have more people asking less suppliers to supply insurance, and so the cost goes up. And it's not just the coastal cities. I mean, that was something that we looked at last year, and we did an analysis on this, is you're seeing things in the Midwest where insurance premiums are going up significantly, and they don't have hurricanes, they don't have wildfires. So it's not just a coastal issue anymore. And so, this is where I think there's just an ebb and flow in the market between, governments, planning and zoning, developers, et cetera, and then just the residents that live in those areas. Like, it's been really easy for the last several decades to just kind of paint a narrative that development is bad by definition. And I think we have to change that narrative to say good development, well thought out development can actually enhance your local community to a point where people want to come there. And some of these new developments that have mixed use components, where you have retail and you have medical office and you have regular office and you have residential all together, for a lot of people, that provides them access to other things that they wouldn't have if they had to live in the suburbs. And we just need to kind of get to a point where the market broadly can look at the benefit from a holistic perspective. And development, by definition, is not a bad thing. Are there bad developments? Yes. Are there bad developers? Yes. Are there developments that are motivated just purely for profit for that individual building without being part of a collective, comprehensive vision for a city? Sure. But should the city take a really restrictive approach to everything that comes in the door? And the default answer, no. The default answer should be, it depends, or the default answer should be, let's see. And I know there's been developers that spend multiple years and hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to get stakeholder buy-in and investment, and they get the community to say, we like this development, and it still doesn't get granted through the P&Z. And, I just think we can do better there broadly. And I hope that with this increasing affordability challenge and the live local stuff, like, I'm a proponent of that. I think we saw this with opportunity zones. When opportunity zones were first implemented, a lot of people were super interested in them, but they didn't really fully understand the benefits, and you didn't see a lot of opportunity zone development. I think people imagined, hey, we have this new tax deferral opportunity that effectively, after a 10-year hold, I think at some level you just basically wipe the capital gains. There's like all this inherent benefit of opportunity zone, but people didn't quite understand this. So you didn't see the immediate reaction, but now you're starting to see a lot of opportunity zone development. And I think the live local stuff in Florida is going to be similar, where like it's a landmark legislative action. You thought immediately you'd probably see 100 new projects come up out of the ground because of it. It's had resistance. It's had pushback. People are trying to figure out how to make it work. But I think as soon as you get 10, 12, 20 of these projects that benefit from that legislation, you're going to see this take off. And I hope that other states adopt similar policies, because denser development that's well thought out, well located, will improve the lives for the people that live in those communities. I'm a proponent of that.
Awesome. Well, I can't think of a better note.
That's fantastic.
That was perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. So at the end of our show, we always do a fun fact, which you already gave yours, right?
Well, I have the numbers, and I'll tell you that. So vacancy rates for primary data center markets in North America hit a record low of 2.8% in the first half of this year. And rents have, for hyperscale tech tenants in North America, rose 19% in the first half of 2024 compared with a year earlier. This is a combination of CBRE data and Green Street data estimates.
Thank you. So I went in a
totally different direction.
Well,
Okay.
you know me in food and Texas. So my fun fact is the top 5 barbecues. He hates when I do this, because then we end and he's like, I'm starving. So these are my 5 picks off of Eater's top 12 barbecue spots in South Florida. And then no preference, just from north to south. Tropical Smokehouse in West Palm Beach. They were a James Beard semifinalist.
Wow.
Four Rivers Smokehouse in Coral Springs. Tom Jenkins in Fort Lauderdale. Uncle Tom's in Miami. And of course, Schreiber's in Homestead. Right. I know I left off Shorty's.
Yeah.
You guys, how about you? You have a favorite barbecue spot in your neck of the woods? Do you live in Dallas or a suburb of Dallas?
Yes, I'm outside of Dallas. It's interesting. I was in Austin for about 6 years, and they have some really, really good barbecue in Austin. But in Dallas area, there's a couple of good barbecue spots. There's one called Pecan Lodge, which is really famous. You can Google it. You can actually order their food online, and they'll ship it to you. It's really, really good. So Pecan Lodge. There's another that just started up probably the last 10 years or so. It came from a food truck, and now they have multiple restaurants called Heim Barbecue. It's Heim. Really, really good. They have some bacon-wrapped burnt ends that are like candy. Oh, it's amazing.
Ooh, that sounds
incredible.
amazing.
Like, so good. And then I actually saw...
Back up for a second. I mean, burnt ends are already delicious as it is. They're bacon-wrapped burnt ends.
Yeah, it's like caramelized bacon wrapped burnt ends. I'm serious. It's you could like, it's like candy. Like, it's like they sell those as a standalone. It's like getting the dessert as a meat. It's incredible. And they have some good jalapeno mac and cheese, like just some really good stuff. My favorite though, in Austin, there's a place called Terry Black's, and I just saw they're opening up some locations here in the DFW metro. So Terry Black's to me is the spot. Like, they have the best barbecue. So
I love it.
All righty. My brother lives in Dallas. Looks like he and you are going to be getting a visit from the two of us sometime in the not distant future.
Let's do it. Every time my colleagues come in from New York, we end up ordering Pecan Lodge to the office. And so as soon as Terry Black's opens, we'll make that a tradition. But if you guys make the trip down, barbecue's on me. Maybe we'll go sample a couple of them and see how they have good cold beer too. So we can check them out.
It's like
really are amazing, and with all the accolades, and when we're reading your CV to everybody, we just want to say that you're beyond that. You're an exceptional human being. It's really always wonderful to see you. You ooze positivity and knowledge, and we're better for knowing you, and we really appreciate this relationship, and we appreciate you being here and a part of our podcast.
Well, thank you. I mean, those are incredibly kind words that I don't deserve. I'm a normal guy that just loves what I do, and to your point on the positivity, like, I'm very fortunate and blessed to be in the role that I'm in. I'm very fortunate and blessed to be able to have friends like you guys in this community, and so I'd be short-sighted to not take advantage and say, how can we all help each other? And you guys have played a vital role in giving me speaking opportunities and creating opportunities for me to kind of share a little bit about what I know. So thank you for having me on, and thank you for the friendship too, for both of you. I mean, it's incredible to now basically have a family in Miami. I mean, it's like every time I'm down there, I have 10 or 12 people that at this point, like, we just know each other and we're friends, and it's really cool that we get to live in a time period where that's possible. So I very much appreciate both of you as well.
Agreed. And I know conference season is in full swing, so we wish you safe travel to all of your, I think you have something like 17?
It's like the next 7 weeks in a row, I'm speaking somewhere, and we tallied it up last year. I had over 65, 70 live presentations in the year, and that's not counting like the webinars that we do monthly at Trepp and other stuff. So it's a huge part of what I do, but I love it. It's as a chief product officer, you have to know what market participants are looking for, and you have to know what they are perceiving taking place in the market. And the best way for me to do that is to be at these events, shaking hands with people, listening to their challenges, listening to what's working well for them. And so, if anyone listening here wants me to come join them on a podcast or present at a conference or whatever, just reach out. I'm more than happy. That's part of what we do at Trepp, and be more than happy to make your acquaintance and see if there's something I can add for you as well.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much, Lonnie.
Yeah, well, thank you everybody for joining us. We appreciate you listening in. I think that you will agree with us that this has been a very special episode, and we appreciate you, providing us feedback and continuing to listening to our humble podcast. So, for Jennifer and I, and for Lonnie, goodbye.
Goodbye.
See you
Thanks.
next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.